The very sharp-eyed amongst you will notice that actually I'm not Carrie Cooper, who normally would be introducing today's distinguished lecture. I'm Roger Goodman, and I'm the chair-elect of the Council of the Academy. And this is my first duty and a huge privilege and a huge pleasure to be able to introduce today's speaker, Professor John Urry. John, as most of you will know, is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Lancaster University, where he has spent his career basically building one of the best sociology departments in the country, actually anywhere in the world. His main interests are in the fields of mobilities, transportation, low carbon futures and tourism, as well as contemporary capitalism. And I was just telling John, the first ever sociology book I bought as an undergraduate in 1978, actually I bought two books in my first year. One was Alan Ryan's The Philosophy of Social Science, and the other one was Keaton Urry, which has just come out. It's still on my bookshelf. In 2003, John became director of the Lancaster Centre for Mobilities Research, and he is the founding co-editor of the journal Mobilities, of which there were some copies upstairs. And of course, as many of you know, he's been the editor of the International Library of Sociology, which is the world's oldest sociology series. John was one of the founding fellows, or academicians as they were then called, of the Academy, and he has served very enthusiastically as a member of the Academy's Council all the way through until 2012, over a period of really very important change and growth in the Academy. He established the Publications Committee, and he's served on several other committees, including chairing the Events Committee. Now, John's most recent book is Offshoring, and this looks at the world of the super rich, offshore funds and their role in wider economic patterns, especially in the world that he knows best, that's of energy supply and how low carbon futures could help rebuild after the 2008 crisis. And there's a lovely quote about the book from Michael Burroy, who says, "Exposing capitalism's expanding economy of secrecy, John Urry reveals a terrifying picture of catastrophes waiting to happen, of global inequalities difficult to comprehend, and of human rights violations on an appalling scale. This is sociology at its best, warning us of the worst. Offshoring should be required reading for all undergraduates." So it's a huge pleasure to invite John Urry to come and give this year's lecture to the Academy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Had a catastrophe with my microphone. I'm not sure it's now functioning at all well. I'm very honoured really to be asked to give this lecture, since I have participated in the Academy in various sorts of ways and had a very pleasant, interesting, enjoyable, and I think a productive period while I had various roles in it, and I'm thrilled to see that it's moving onwards and upwards in impressive ways. And so that's very good. I'm very pleased about participating in this event. And I want to talk about offshore worlds, processes of offshoring, of which you can see some listed in this slide. And to my mind, the problem of offshoring interestingly interconnects with the issue of the commons. The fate of what is held in common has never appeared as problematic as today, with many processes of climate change, population growth, food and water shortages, energy competition threatening the global commons of planet Earth, as well as many other smaller scale commons. Much, as we know, that had been thought of as public has been in various ways privatised, enclosed, commercialised or outsourced. Even, of course, research and knowledge relating to those issues. But this has not, of course, occurred without a certain degree of struggle and imaginaries of collective ownership, well-being and use. And there have been various ways in which various kinds of entities are held, managed and imagined as in some way common. So this talk examines a kind of struggles between ideas of the commons or multiple commons and some of the offshore worlds which have those processes of commons making. And I very much like this quote of Britton Catlin, who describes the negative dark spirit pervading the offshore world and its secret paraphernalia and hidden practices. And it's some of those that secret paraphernalia and hidden practices that I shall try to describe and to examine some of their consequences. Sometimes it seems that these offshore worlds have been a strategic development, facilitating the privatising of various commons. And Warren Buffett, my favourite commentators, describes the way in which there is a class warfare, all right, and he says it's my class, the rich class, that's making war and we're winning. And in a way I'm going to sort of explore some of the implications of that and how that was brought about. And partly it's been brought about waging that war through generating offshored worlds that undermine, problematize, upset, disrupt various kinds of commons. But I'm also then interested in, can the idea of commons in some ways be deployed to reduce the rate, scale and impact of these offshore worlds. So the 1980s onwards saw the striking emergence of various interdependent global processes. This is as towards the end of the 1980s people began to talk about globalization, the global economy and various other aspects of global societies. And many commentators, or most commentators, were thought this was positively transforming through an increased borderlessness and the forming of many new kinds of relations and connections, including new kinds of commons. Writing in 1990, Kelechi Omai, in his book on the borderless world, talks of the free flow of ideas, individuals, investments, industries. The emergence of an internet economy brings with it an erosion of national sovereignty, and the power of information, of the borderlessness of information, touches most aspects of social life. And this was a moment, a very interesting moment, I think, around 1990. It was the year in which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced its first report in 1990. There were many ideas of novel businesses, cosmopolitan polities, international friendship patterns, family lives, international understanding being generated by the borderlessness, especially through the new flows of information and communication. Many believe that these societies would be invigorated by such freer flows of ideas, information and people. And I think there were a number of very interesting changes that took place around 1990. All of these will be familiar to you, but I think it's useful to kind of consider them as a sort of package. I'm very much taken by there are sort of turning points in history, and I think around 1990, with the ending of Soviet communism, new kinds of news reporting, particularly during the first Gulf War, financial markets, the invention of the web by Tim Berners-Lee, new business models, and these collectively had the effect, as Joe Stiglitz says, generating a 1990s global optimism, a roaring 1990s, as he put it. And This is a significant moment and transformative, and what it did was to generate a kind of belief in and kind of imaginary of a sort of borderless future. But that decade turned out to be not the harbinger of a new 21st century borderless world, but almost the opposite. It turned out that all of this movement of ideas, people, information, money and so on had many dark sides. Migrating across borders were not just consumer goods and new kind of consumer services, what often was called in that period the experience economy, but also environmental risks, trafficked women, drug runners, terrorists, international criminals, outsourced work, slave traders, asylum seekers, property speculators, smuggled workers, waste, financial risks, and untaxed income, to name a few anyway. All of these flows across borders make the achievement of common interests, of commons, much more problematic as multiple borders and boundaries developed and multiplied. And so what I tried to do in this book that was kindly referred to earlier, called Offshoring, was to try to sort of document this array of offshored processes, of what I loosely call a kind of secret gardens, secret routeways. So rather than I kind of play with the paradox, what appeared to be what was supposedly generating a kind of openness of movement, it was the opposite, which was also coming into being through the moving of resources, practices, people's days from territory to territory, but often moving them along and hiding them within various kinds of secret routes. And some of this involves rule breaking. Some of it's illegal, such as tax evasion. Some of it's kind of getting round the spirit of the law, such as tax avoidance. And some of it is to be able to use laws in one jurisdiction to undermine those in another. And so I kind of characterize this as secrets and lies necessary for and part of this offshore world. This offshore world rests upon either new or very much significantly enhanced systems, particularly systems of movement. The astonishing growth of container-based cargo shipping, which I've also just edited a book partly about, the development of extensive air travel, the internet, and multiple virtual worlds, including, of course, the deep web, large increases of car lorry traffic, which is often lorry traffic obviously interconnected with the container-based cargo shipping, electronic money transfer systems, which are very much part of a world of the smuggling of goods and laundering of money. The growth of various kinds of expertise which is oriented to avoiding national regulations, and more generally the proliferation of many mobile lives, both legal and illegally moving across borders. So I think that set of changes and transformations also is very much part of what seems to be like a world of openness, is also a world that permits multiple kinds of offshore relations. So this offshoring world, as I like to describe it, is dynamic. It reorganizes economic, social, political and material relations within societies and between societies. Populations and states find more and more resources, practices, people and monies are made or kept secret and unrealizable. And so it's a world of concealment, of secret gardens, as we might say. Central to some of that, I think, is the whole role and growth of the internet, which have the effect of delocalizing virtual environments, enabling many kinds of movement digitally along routeways lying in the shadows. And they have some effects, I think, on delocalizing production, consumption and sociability. Processes of offshoring are interestingly varied. They range from those which are literally offshore, out of sight, over the horizon, while other aspects are kind of in a way onshore, but nevertheless have some of the same characteristics. And I think an interesting feature in all of that is water. Water is not much researched by social scientists. You may say for very good reason that most people do not live on water and most live on land. About three quarters of the Earth's surface is water. And I think an offshoring world is particularly dependent upon what some writers have just produced a new edited book called Water Worlds, upon power at sea and the power of the sea. Moving off land are where many rules and regulations are more easily evaded. Oceans are literally and metaphorically over the much is out of sight of states, law enforcers and regulators. And in this very nice book by Langewiesche, he describes our world as an ocean world and it is wild. And he describes the process of constructing and reinforcing a free market sea. So what do we have at sea? Well, first of all, the oceans contain many unregulated treasure islands of low tax and much pleasure, that I'll come back to. There are many ships flying flags of convenience, where apparently you could register your ship in 24 hours, and there can be almost no rules and regulations about, for example, the thickness of the steel which is used in their construction, let alone the quality of or conditions of work for the people working on board. We might say conditions of work are driven to the bottom. Oceans, of course, are places where terrible experiences happen to poor migrants, losing their life as their ships smash onto rocks. Oceans are also a global rubbish dump, with the Great Pacific Garbage Patch in the Pacific Ocean said to be twice the size of France, which is something stunning. And then there are unregulated climates, as the outlaw sea subjects humans to its heightened unruliness as more intense storms, hurricanes, storm surges, rising sea levels and flooding boomerang back onto land. So the sea, I think, is a rather significant feature of all of this. It's almost a world without much government, taxes, laws, and where powerful ships and their companies survive. It's a kind of unruly space, not really governed or owned by states, mostly risky, free and unregulated. And of course contemporary oceans thus demonstrate a kind of tragedy of the commons, of watery commons. There are many different offshoring practices. Offshoring production to cheaper sites, reducing tax liabilities, creating many offshore companies, rendering new forms of financialization, developing expertise in novel ways of marginalizing workforces, developing new places of pleasure away from observation and regulation by friends and family, extracting infrastructural investment from states, generating waste, and creating astonishing new products. So these all derive from this global freedom to move. Money is income, wealth, people, waste, and loyalties from pillar to post. And I will now demonstrate some of that. Well, this slide partly lists some of those features. I suppose Olympic Games villages are a bit interesting because they're predominantly untaxed during the period in which the Olympic Games is held, apparently in East London, but in a kind of offshore at the same time. The development of CO2 emissions, which are offshored, and a number of others. I have some sort of little visual illustrations of this. These are incidentally drawn from Offshoring the video, if anybody is interested, which is a YouTube video. So those are some of the processes, and I'm going to say a bit more now about tax, but before doing so I want to suggest that this generation of offshore worlds was no accident. In various secret societies and meetings, significant figures plotted the development of offshore worlds during the long period of post-war Keynesianism. In particular, in 1947 in Switzerland, the country that was and to some degree still is the world's premier tax haven, a senior bank official brought together scholars to a secret meeting at Mont Pelerin near Geneva. This was the first of many such meetings organised to revive liberalism, in this case under the direction of Hayek. This meeting and the subsequent development of the Mont Pelerin Society, funded by Swiss banks, was central in commencing the global fight back against Keynesianism. Keynes, of course, died in 1946. A Keynesianism which had involved support for various kinds of state intervention, for the idea that there's a national economy, a kind of commons, as opposed to specific corporations. And I think in particular there's been a spectacular success of those secret meetings and the array of think tanks that developed around that. And what that has enabled is the development of the movement of finance and wealth to and through the world's 60 to 70 tax havens, which is a very striking figure. Something like a third to a quarter of all societies are in some sense, I know this is a hugely contested category, and these are some of the countries and cities that are said to be in some way or another tax havens. And some of that was very much produced or followed on from the elimination of various sorts of exchange controls around 1979, 1980. And thus to be offshore is to be in a kind of paradise by comparison with the high state, high tax life experienced onshore. So I see tax havens, not all of these obviously, are places of escape and freedom, a paradise of low taxes, wealth management, deregulation, good transport, and often nice speeches. And one of the one of the places that has particularly interested me is Dubai, which is a tax haven. It's a centre of leisure and pleasure. It has the world's tallest building. It has many of the iconic kind of sports stadia. It has very little has no income or corporation tax, and has kind of it's sort of its quote success. It was a completely desolate and derelict area of land 40 to 50 years ago. During the 2000s, it was the world's largest building site, with more cranes there than anywhere else, and is the 8th most visited city in the world currently. And so sort of somehow that's Dubai symbolises for me, or encapsulates, many of the elements and components of these offshore worlds that have become so significant, in my opinion. Just to note the ways in which part of this process is having offshore accounts and subsidiaries, often running into hundreds, while Goldman Sachs is said to have 4,000 offshore subsidiaries, many of which are located in a variety of quotes tax havens. But in general, all major companies have offshore accounts and subsidiaries. More than half of world trade is said to pass through pass through in some sense. Almost all high net worth individuals appear to possess offshore accounts, enabling multiple ways of tax planning. And it is said to be said that there are something like 10 million people currently own the 21 trillion US dollars offshore fortune, which is a sum equivalent to the combined GDPs of the US and Japan. So this is not insignificant. I don't imagine you thought it was. And in many ways, we go back to Warren Buffett. What he was describing is a set of processes which made possible this what he called the class warfare of the rich class. Now, in all of this, I think the world of journalism has played an absolutely has been seminal in revealing and documenting this offshore world, more so than the academy has done. Maybe that's true in lots of other areas. Nicholas Shaxson describes how offshore is how the world of power now works. Very clear. And there are many complexities, obviously, in this sort of calculation, but one set of figures suggests a shift of offshore money. That's kind of a quite general term, from something like a few billion in the revolutionary year of 1968 to 2010 of something like 20 odd trillion. So a pretty spectacular increase in offshoring, which I did this chart from Der Spiegel, I think, kind of neatly encapsulates the relative scale of different economic and financial flows. The smallest circle being the value of all goods and services produced, something like 63 trillion, and then the scale of various other kinds of financial stocks and shares, financial derivatives, and foreign currency transactions. And you can see the kind of sense of financial significance, or relative financial significance. So if we were setting up a tax haven, what should we be providing? A good offshore tax haven, and it's very interesting looking at the documentation from legal firms, accountants, states, as to what should be in a good tax haven and how this particular state is providing these facilities. Generally, a good tax haven should not tax income, profits or inheritance. There should be availability of different currencies, operate online and not require personal visits, although tax havens often have, as I said before, good transport connections. New accounts, opening an account in the banks in that place should require minimum documentation. There should be bank secrecy with no, this is now being much contested, but until recently no tax information exchange agreements with other countries. And it should be possible to open bank accounts without your own name or the name of your company appearing on that account. So there should not be a public registry, or if there's a public registry, there will be a nominee director. So this is what, roughly speaking, with some considerable variation, a good tax haven would provide. And just, I think there's an absolutely appalling history of the British state and its role in establishing these many tax havens in the Caribbean, partly as a development strategy for a number of places. And the Cayman Islands is a kind of notorious example of that. And also, I think, just thinking about what makes a successful haven is also an interesting combination of stability and mobility. So stability, to ensure that this is a place for business. People trust that the money is safe, that companies can be formed and reformed with ease and security, that a person's word can be trusted, and that's very important, secure legal environment, and that the banks do not go bust or get accused of fraud. Actually, that's quite hard to find places where that's still true. But mobility is also important, that money can move in and out safely and securely, in and out of what Nicholas Shaxson calls the Treasure Islands. Also that people can move in and out easily, safely and effectively. So secure communications both for monetary transactions and for people for intermittent visits by investors. So these are some interesting features, and what I now will just go on to do is to say a little bit about so there's movement here. Well, studies of the people deploying and using tax havens show that, as it's been said, you don't live anywhere and neither does your money, or rather you live everywhere and so does your money. So this is a sort of world of rapid movement across oceans, and for many of those people, I'm sure nobody in this room here, homes dotted around the world, endless business travel, private schools, family life structured around get-togethers, private leisure clubs, ground transport, private jets, etc., etc. And so we can sort of see partly these places are also places that get visited, where people have houses, place, property and power, we might say, are intertwined, forming and sustaining a network, and often hidden rich class, avoiding the commons and generating complex private routeways. And this generates, of course, powerful interest to protect and further extend the bases of such unequally distributed income and wealth. And I see offshoring as absolutely key part of those processes of reproducing economic and social inequalities, and yet relatively under-examined in a lot of literature. Interestingly, this is of course a world which is no longer simply accepted. It is now contested. So the power of offshore is not just fixed. And in a sort of way, if you set up secrets, you then set up those who can make money or make their fame and fortune, or develop a social movement around contesting those secrecies. So secrecies produced all sorts of interest to reveal those secrets. And clearly, as you will all know, since say around 2000, I think it probably is the right moment to look at as well, since around 2000, issues of tax and the role of tax havens has become central to what I like to call the new a sort of counter politics of taxation, and a slightly more general interest in offshoring, the offshoring of waste, the issue of CO2 emissions generated by manufacturing, probably most of the goods and services in this room, in China. The offshoring of torture through the programme of extraordinary rendition, and so on. So there's a kind of, this offshore world has not been and is not simply kept secret. And in relationship to tax, there are many critical reports. Actually, I think major charities have played a very interesting role in that. Media stories, campaigning, NGOs, World Social Forum, actually the OECD and to some extent the EU, seeking to curb unfair tax competition. The critique of corporations heavily involved in, I should say, tax avoidance and evasion. And in a sense also lots of direct action as well. And the role of a number of major organisations such as the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and I think especially in the UK, the Tax Justice Network has played a massively significant role exposing and denigrating. I also quite like this term tax dodging, which glosses the distinction between what's formally legal or illegal. So this counter politics of tax is now a torrent, and what it has done is to have made of tax no longer just a private matter. It has made it in a way part of a kind of commons. Much direct action, NGO activities, government reports, and a kind of tax activism have exposed and denigrated many of these forms of tax dodging. Some of which is also clearly to do with the sort of inequalities between large corporations which are able to, in some ways or other, avoid taxing, as opposed to small and medium companies which don't have anything like those opportunities. So there's a sort of the sense that there is a non-level field, I think is a very important feature. So what has happened is all tax shaming, a major political issue developing into a global movement, strikingly shown in early 2013 when the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists received in their mail a computer hard drive packed with corporate data and personal information and emails, 260 gigabytes of data stemming from 10 offshore jurisdictions and including details of more than 122,000 offshore companies. And it showed that those setting up offshore entities were, in these cases at least, mostly from China, Hong Kong, Russia and former Soviet republics. Many positions are held by nominee directors whose names, astonishingly, can appear in hundreds of companies. Other authors have begun to generalize this issue of tax. Some claiming, for example, that tax is a feminist issue. Large corporations and rich individuals are easily forced to defend their tax position, often seeking what we might call a tax wash to keep the scandal-hungry media and protesters at bay. So this is an interesting procedure threatens the world's major brands, in fact pretty well all the world's major brands, have been subject to public scrutiny and potential shaming. And this of course reveals the power of the commons to fight back. So what I think, I suppose this talk is seeking to do is to put onto the agenda for social science the issue of these offshore worlds. I know many people here will be familiar with some aspects, but I think we have neglected those somewhat and this is a significant loss. This has various consequences. I think societies get weakened through social inequalities resulting from these offshoring processes. Offshoring and the resulting inequalities is implicated in the processes of CO2 emissions generation. Moreover, when we think of offshore, this does not literally have to be offshore. We might say that offshore is everywhere, and one company's onshore as another's offshore. And this is why I very much like this quotation from Richard Murphy, who describes it's almost like some sort of post-structuralist theorist or Deleuzean or sort of about these illicit financial flows don't flowing through locations as such, but float through the secrecy space generated by the relationship between these secrecy jurisdictions. They float over and around locations as if in an unregulated ether. I think it's rather a brilliant quotation. And as a consequence, this unregulated ether can't be easily regulated, obviously not easily regulated by national states. It may not be regulatable at all. So we can describe a world of multiple secrets developing on a scale in and through this unregulated ether, almost impossible to tame. So I probably should come to a brief conclusion. So what could be done about it, all of this or any of this? This is I think a serious challenge. It's a serious challenge both for sort of social order, and it's also a serious challenge for issues of climate change and energy security. And so one thing that I tried to document a little bit in this book on offshoring are some of the forms of what I call reassuring, which I don't really have much time to go through, but is built around arguments about money and resources should be subject to clear, transparent and accountable contestation between the members of a given society. That's my kind of starting point. And most of the things I've been describing in some way, in very varied ways, conceal that set of clear, transparent and accountable contestation, although the revelations by activists and leading media organisations, and to a little extent academics, do something to kind of bring back that transparency and accountability. In some sense we might describe activities should be brought back home, but that's a very tricky notion. Some of the sorts of ideas in relationship to taxing corporations involve country by country reporting, that is dividing, roughly speaking, the activities of a corporation into the countries by which those activities are located. In relationship to waste, the principle of proximity. I've written recently quite a lot about so-called 3D printing and the possibility of producing goods as close as possible to where they are needed. That socio-technical system of 3D printing might enable. I think some of the arguments about renewable energies might also be characterised in terms of smaller scale of production and distribution. There's the significance of CO2 emissions, which have been so significantly offshored in climate change negotiations, and in potential future agreements those should be brought into being. And finally, I think the significance of whistleblowers. I think whistleblowers are an utterly crucial part of the revealing, making transparent these offshore worlds. I don't see how you could do them without whistleblowers. If you go to the UK government website, it says marvellous things about how important it is to facilitate whistleblowing, but only for certain kinds of activities and not others. I suppose part of this also would entail what I like to call, in relationship to energy, a global low carbon civil society that might play a role in offshoring, in reshoring, in and across many different societies. And to return to Britain, Catalan, we might say that what we need to ensure is that which was offshored should go back onshore, reattached to the body of society in league with nature, where freedom must move people together and not push them apart. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely wonderful tour de force of gender setting, and if that's not social science, I don't know what is social science. John's very kindly agreed to take questions. I think we've got about 10 or so minutes before we go back upstairs for tea. Would anybody like to start off with a comment, a question, or yes, please.
One of the elements you didn't really address much was, in fact, the role of governments in a direct sense, but more international agencies, OECD, World Bank, G7, and all the rest of it. Are they part of the problem or potentially part of the solution?
Yes, I think they're both part of the problem and part of the solution. Clearly there have been various sorts of innovation, the OECD as you referred to, the EU, which has been promoting the country-by-country reporting programs. They're a bit reactive, and of course they can also be swamped by other kinds of agendas as well. So the sort of the power of other agendas to facilitate and promote some of these processes, and actually, so I think it's actually a matter of big contestation at this time to try to mobilise and move all sorts of entities to bring these to reveal some of these processes. But they're actually very obviously very problematic. I mean, for example, to say some of the governments, of course, are themselves implicated in many of the tax and other processes. Obviously, partly the organisations of cities and countries may well be involved in trying to sustain their industries, such as some of the industries to do waste and recycling and so on. So this is it's not an easy thing, not at all an easy thing to achieve. So I think it's actually a bit on a tipping point, really, and and so those forces of journalists, investigative journalists, processes of shaming, etc., I think are all going to be part of how that can be developed.
Yes, please, at the back.
Until 2 years ago, I knew practically nothing about the Royal Navy, and I've had a rapid induction in terms of the last couple of years. And I just wondered whether that was something, or a body or a group, that you considered at all, because in many of the things you were talking about, particularly piracy and so on, they play quite a crucial role in maintaining and brokering new power relations. Is that something you consider?
Yes, I know absolutely nothing about that. Nevertheless, I'll try and say something. One of the things I think, reading this stuff about the sea, about the oceans, has been really fascinating. And there's now, as I say, a sort of a group of watery social scientists who are interested in and developing expertise. And the ways in which the sea is so unregulated. Obviously, another part of this, my book has a longish section about piracy. What are the conditions under which piracy and the difficulties of sustaining relations at sea, how to administer them, who has rights. Obviously that's fantastically relevant to the Mediterranean at the moment and so on. So I suppose what I might just say is that I think water worlds demand our attention very significantly, and maybe that's just a plea for other people to engage in that kind of work.
Yes, please.
You talk about the proximity principle.
Yeah.
You talk about distributed manufacturing through 3D printing and so on.
Yeah.
And a couple of problems came to my mind. One was with the proximity principle, what do you do with nuclear power waste? There are some things that are actually better centrally disposed of somewhere in a safe way. And of course the attitudes towards nuclear power have been changing because of its implications for security and energy supply and so on. And the 3D printing, I'm reminded of what happened in my university, which is the administration are always in favour of centralised printing facilities because they appear to be cheaper, volume and so on, one big machine. But every member of faculty wants their own localised printing.
Yeah.
And the point about that is, of course, that there are some predictions that the internet will consume more energy than the airline system within the next 10 years. Wow. And indeed all of the UK's power in the next 35. So decentralised systems are not necessarily more energy efficient.
No, those are very powerful points. And I wasn't trying to say they would constitute the only solution. The thing about proximity is already, I can't remember the name of the procedure on that, but it is already the sort of principle that in theory is enshrined in relationship to the disposal of certain kinds of waste. So I'm obviously not wanting to say that all waste should be disposed of in that way, although as somebody who lives in the northwest of England and sees nuclear waste trundling through Lancaster Station, I know there's already all sorts of processes of disposal to other parts of the country. The 3D printing is very complicated. I had a research project on that, and where we were interviewing 3D designers, innovators, engineers, and so on. And it, to my mind, is a possibility. One of the various scenario futures on 3D printing, and one of those would be a kind of much stronger localization of manufacturing, and in which in effect the digital designs travel, and then the material object is produced closer to where the consumer is, either by the consumer or in a print shop down the high street. And there's one sort of vision of 3D printing which would have sort of high street small-ish printing shops. It's one possibility, and I don't want to suggest it's the only one. but obviously the current trend for containerization and the manufacture tens of thousands of miles away, which has obviously many environmental costs, is probably something that is, not should somehow be reversed, and 3D printing might be one way that could be brought about.
Thank you. Now I'm very conscious that tea awaits us upstairs, but also I know there's some people with some questions. What I suggest we do is we collect as many different questions and comments as possible, and then we give John 60 seconds at the end, 80 seconds
to choose which ones.
To choose exactly. I was going to say which ones he wants to respond to. So I know there's one here.
Yeah, I thought it was a really fantastic lecture, and it was very wet in a very good way. But I was interested, you didn't mention Bauman and liquid modernity, which seems to chime and resonate with what you were saying. But just going back to an issue you just made, as a political scientist, I'm interested in the evolution of democracy, and what are the implications for offshoring for redesigning democracy?
So do you want to park that one, and then there was one here.
What's your view of the conspiracy theorists?
Well, definitely want to park that one. There's one here.
Do you think we have anything to learn by looking at the moment which borders are closed in 1914 and the kind of free flow of goods, information, people throughout Europe that characterises the latter phases of the Industrial Revolution comes to an abrupt halt?
Any other last comments, questions? Yes, please.
A quick comparative one. I just read Michael Rye's book on the North Sea in the post-Roman era, and which describes the North Sea run by Frisians, Vikings, whatever, as very like the picture of the world you just undid. The unrolled sea, when everything is people and traffic, so is goods, and it's nothing but terrible, but money sways the day, and so on. That period in European history was actually solved by aggressive nation building and armies that actually took over and defined territory. Whether it was guilds or whatever it was, were broken up by national states with strong armies. Do you think something similar is likely to happen if you take what goes on in Russia and in China and a few other places at the moment?
Okay, I'm going to add my own, which is your penultimate slide was called reshoring. Is there any possibility at all of the genie going back into the bottle and any form of regulation, really? Too many interests have now been released to actually make any difference in terms of any regulation or whistleblowing. So please pick and choose as you wish those words.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for those comments. Maybe we can chat over tea. Conspiracy. Yes, I've got more and more keen on conspiracy theories. Actually, all those clever arguments that we mounted against conspiracy theories, I don't think quite so plausible. And what, of course, there are lots of conspiracies. Quite clearly, and I very briefly documented the conspiracy dating from 1947 and so on, and which is somewhat revealed in that book by David Runciman on neoliberalism and so on, which documents all of that in lots of documents a conspiracy or set of overlapping conspiracies. So I think that's pretty significant. What, of course, conspiracies don't do is necessarily realise what they want to realise, and they often have all sorts of unintended, perverse consequences, wicked problems, and so on and so forth. But in general, I'm much taken by the power of conspiracies. I don't think that we can imagine. Well, I think it's extremely hard to imagine reversal. I'm very interested in the whole way in which systems get kind of momentum, or the genie is let out of the bottle. And in fact, often there are multiple genies are let out of the bottle, and which interconnect with each other and kind of move economies or societies in particular directions, which make it hard to imagine reversal. And thus I think that the end here, comments about reshoring seem rather feeble in relationship to the kind of arguments that I've probably briefly set out in the first 3/4 of this talk. So I think reversal is extremely hard, but I do think in relationship to both issues of democracy and issues of climate change, which I suppose are my two sort of animating discourses in this talk, it's really significant to think what might come to reverse that. And there was a comment about nation states and Vikings and so on. I think the chances of that happening are extremely slim, and that's sort of why I came to make this point about what I call civil society, in this case a kind of global low carbon civil society. And I don't know that on its own can do much, but that on its own, supported and stimulated by states, and also colleagues were pointing to the importance of international organisations that kind of reconfigure the environment. And slightly more generally, I've been thinking a lot about this in relationship to low carbon worlds, which I see as very much sort of part of or subset of this issue about offshoring. And I suppose finally, I think transparency is fantastically significant. And it does seem to me these systems and processes are opaque. And it's absolutely wrong that they are opaque. They may be justified, but they certainly should not be opaque. And so I suppose the plea would be a kind of, a plea would be that the social sciences should play a role in making these less transparent, but also all sorts of other organisations, journalism, media, etc., etc. So I think that would be a start.
What can I say? I think that's almost the perfect place also to end.
You
summarise what I think is the remit of the academy, which is to take social sciences writ large and apply them to real world problems. And I think today's lecture has been the perfect example of that. The only problem is I can't imagine what we're going to do next year. But can I thank you, John, very much indeed for a really wonderful